Hey guys, and welcome to the second video in our unit on Greece. So where we left off the last time, we were talking about Greek colonization. And today we're going to start off with discussing how one of those colonies led the Greek city-states into conflict with the largest and most dominant empire of that age, and that was Persia. So the Persian Wars were a series of wars that lasted from about 500 to 479 BCE. And what starts it off is this Greek city-state of Ionia. Right here. Ionia was on the very far western frontier of the Persian Empire, kind of on the Aegean Sea. Greece would be right on the other side of where this map ends. This is all today modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor as it was known back in the ancient world. And a lot of these were actually Greek settlements, right? Remember we showed on the previous one about, the Greeks really had dominated and colonized all around the Aegean. So the Ionians rebel against Persian rule. Even though the Persians were relatively cool to live under, the Greeks just kind of chafed under foreign rule, and they were very kind of headstrong and ethnocentric about it. And they said, no, we're not going to submit to Persian rule. Well, that in and of itself wouldn't have been that big of a deal because it wasn't that difficult for the Persians to smack them back into place. Athens decides to get involved. So Athens sends help to Ionia. The Persians are still able to defeat them, but Darius is so incensed that the Athenians would be so presumptuous and so disrespectful to send aid that he becomes obsessed with defeating them. And so the Persians eventually stage a large attack onto Greece itself. Okay, so you got the Ionian Rebellion, and this culminates in 490 BCE with the Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians, against the odds, are able to defeat a much larger Persian force. And yes, Marathon is 26.2 miles from Athens, and the messenger running back and forth and then collapsing dead. That's where we get the race from. So the Persians kind of have to not necessarily retreat, but just give up on their hopes of destroying Greece right then and there. But Darius's dream of conquering Greece would be picked up by his son Xerxes, and in 480 he launches a massive invasion of the Greek peninsula. And this would be where you have some of the more well-known in pop culture battles, such as the 300 Spartans and so forth. But it also really serves to unite the Greeks against the Persians. It was the first time that it gave the Greeks a very strong sense of unity against a common foe. And there we go. We got all the massive Persians. All right. Now, let me erase this. The reason I'm showing this map is here's Greece over here. Here's Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Empire. Yeah, first Darius and then Xerxes were upset that the Greeks were able to turn them back. But look at the size of the Persian Empire compared to Greece. It really wasn't a matter of that the Greeks humbled and brought the Persians to their knees. It was more that Persia just figured, this isn't worth it. We're not going to go through with this anymore. And so they just kind of gave up. So the Greeks looked at it as this massive stance against foreign invaders. The Persians were like, enough, we don't care. Okay, let them do their own thing. So while that may have seemed in the short term as a huge victory for the Greeks, it actually led later on down the road to conflict. And this was because of growing resentment between some of the major city-states, namely Sparta and Athens. See, Athens emerges as the top power in Greece after the Persian Wars. They were looked at basically as being like the Greek captains that led them to victory against the Persians. And they decide to form their alliance known as the Delian League. See the map here. Okay, here's Athens and its kind of immediate city-state territory, all the areas in yellow and then all of this in blue and so forth. Those are all part of the Delian League. Okay, you see down here, that was Athenian state territory, and then you got these two here, league members, either conferring funds or conferring ships. But Athens was the one who dominated all of this. So essentially, the Aegean, in many ways, becomes like a mini Athenian empire, with Athens really calling all the shots. And they could be, relatively cool leaders, and sometimes they could be not so cool leaders. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. You notice the main area that's outside of their control. Okay, this red area here on the Peloponnesus plain. And who's right in this? Sparta. Okay, so this was Spartan state territory and the Peloponnesian League. Sparta basically had enough of Athens. They didn't respect them enough, and they were getting very, very resentful that they were taking all of the credit for beating the Persians and were now, dominating all trade and taxation that was coming in through the Aegean. All right, so this was destined to just blow up in people's faces, and it did. Let's get rid of all of that. Those weird squiggly lines that it looks like now. So, Sparta is victorious in this, but it wasn't a grand, long-lasting victory. They weren't able to hold on to their dominant spot, and other city-states such as Thebes and Corinth would eventually emerge as being the top ones. But overall, it had the long-term effect of destabilizing the region. Greece had that one moment of unity and unification after beating Persia, and they squandered it, very quickly, fighting amongst themselves. Athens had lost their moral high ground as well. Yeah, they were the cradle of democracy and, this bastion of learning and participation, the way that Pericles would make it out to be. But they also had shown a darker side, such as their treatment of Milos, that island that we talked about in class, where they wouldn't sign up with Athens. So Athens had all of the men murdered and sold all of the women and children to slavery. So Athens really getting knocked down a couple of pegs, and the destabilization of the region, all of the weakening of the city-states, it left Greece open to conquest from the outside. And that would come from a region to the north known as Macedonia. Now, Macedonia historically is a border state with Greece. You look at the blue shaded region up here is the historic Macedonia. The white are your modern day boundaries. This right here, that is the current country of Macedonia, and then it kind of goes into Greece and Bulgaria and Albania and Serbia even a little bit as well. But they were not technically considered to be Greek by the Greek city-states. They were barbarians according to their definition, but they had throughout the 5th and 6th centuries BCE, they began to really kind of accumulate power and build a stronger, more centralized state. And this would culminate in the rule of Philip II. Philip II in 338 BCE succeeds in conquering Greece. And he had dreams of going over the Aegean and expanding into Persian territory, but wasn't able to do that because he was assassinated 2 years later in 336 BCE. Right after he was assassinated, though, the throne goes to one of his younger sons. He had a bunch of sons with a couple of different wives, but kind of a not a front runner for the title, but emerged as being the guy to take over the helm, and that was his son Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great came to the throne at the age of 20, so he was very young, but immediately established himself as being both a charismatic and brilliant leader. He was a brilliant strategist. He just had a knack for it when it came to leading men into battle. So they followed him, and they followed him all over the known world. You see his conquests, starting here in Macedonia. Okay, really immediately after his father's death, he sets out on fulfilling his father's dream of conquering Persian territory. So he makes his way through Sardis and through Asia Minor, okay, and first turns south into Egypt. There was a lot of money to be made to take over the Nile Delta right here. Takes over Memphis and eventually establishes the city of Alexandria. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Makes his way up through the Fertile Crescent, through Persia, completely destroys Persepolis, and then up through Bactria and so forth. Eventually makes it as far as the Indus River Valley. We talked about that in the unit on India. Was forced to turn back because his men basically said, we've had enough. Okay, so never made it all the way back. In 323, he became very suddenly ill and died, but left this huge, huge legacy of a massive empire, and we'll talk more about the cultural impact that it had as well. But the problem is that there was no true heir to his empire. He didn't have a son to leave it to. So his empire was divided up amongst his generals, and these became known as the Hellenistic Empire. It was the result of Alexander's conquests. Now, Hellenistic, the word, comes from the term Hellas, meaning Greek. The Hellenistic empires were largely Greek in culture, but they were a mix of a number of other cultures, such as Persian, Egyptian, Babylonian, other Central Asian cultures. Remember, cultural diffusion. Warfare is a big reason why it happens. And it also kind of linked trade between Asia into the Mediterranean world. you see this map of your Hellenistic empires. So the Silk Road would have run right through here, all the way into it. So it gets divided up into a couple. It gets divided by as generals, and the names of the different the names of the different empires are named for the generals. So the first one that we got here, the Antigonid one, where am I here? Blue. Okay, this is kind of the more traditional, Macedonian homeland. It was the smallest, but it also was the closest to Greece, and so it held that strong connection for them. So that was a big one for them. The other one here, the Ptolemaic kingdom, that was obviously not the biggest, but that was the wealthiest because you controlled the Nile River and you controlled Alexandria right here. Okay, their culture would remain largely Egyptian. Their Egyptian customs and beliefs and so forth. While you did see some Greek influence in there, they maintained a very distinct identity about themselves. And Alexandria was a big center of trade. It was a multicultural community as well. You had Greeks, you had Etruscans, you had Phoenicians, you had Persians, you had Arabs, early Arab merchants that would make their way in there. So it was this big kind of melting pot that would go in there. It became a center of learning as well. You had the famous museum and library of Alexandria, which have since been destroyed. But the Ptolemaic dynasty, that would last up until Roman times when they would become a vassal state of Rome, and the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra, would die. We'll learn more about her later. And there's really, really big one here, the Seleucid Empire. Remember, we learned about that in Persia, named for the one Seleucus. And this is where you really saw a huge mix of Greek and Asian cultures in with each other, particularly in some of these regions, such as Bactria. The Seleucids, they were not fully accepted by a lot of these Persians, so they were eventually deposed, but, the Greek influence remained. And you see that with some of these the sculptures and the architecture. This sculpture we've seen before, where you have Buddha. This is from Bactria. Where you have the Buddha here. Very much an Asian symbol, and then you've got Heracles right next to him. Okay, Greek demigod representing strength. Side by side, you have Greek mythology, and you got Buddhism. And over here, you have a Doric temple from what today would be Afghanistan. A Doric column that was found in a temple in what today would be Afghanistan. So that was common that you saw that type of stuff. You see, influence of Greek language in there as well, and it would have far-ranging impact. Okay, so that does it for the Hellenistic empires, and in the next video we will talk about culture and trade.